Violets in the field. It was the summer I was 8, the summer my mom and I moved in with my grandparents after the divorce. They lived on a small farm, one of those old creaky places with a couple of cows, some chickens, a goat, and a dog named Millie. The farm was quiet, peaceful, and I spent most of my days outside, wandering the fields or playing fetch with Millie. One afternoon, maybe a week after we'd arrived, I was playing in the tall grass when I saw a girl my age standing by the edge of the woods, watching me. "Hi," I called out hesitantly. She smiled, her face lighting up like she'd been waiting for me to speak. She walked over and introduced herself as Violet. When I asked what she was doing in the field, she said she lived a few houses away and loved to come out here. Now, where my grandparents lived, a few houses away didn't just mean a block down the road. It meant at least a mile. But I was 8, and I didn't think much of it. We started playing together every day after that. Hide and seek in the fields, running through the trees, or sitting on the big rock in the woods. Violet was quiet at times, almost sad. I remember her telling me once, "This is the happiest I've been in a long time." I assumed she meant because it was summer vacation, and I didn't disagree. I invited her to come over for lunch one day. She shook her head. "Sorry," Violet told me, her eyes dropping. "I can only meet you outside." I thought that was strange and wondered if her parents were overly strict, but it didn't really matter. We were just kids. We played, we laughed, and I didn't question it. One day I was out with Millie, and we were walking to our usual spot in the field when I saw Violet again. She looked excited to see us. "Do you want to play fetch with Millie?" I called out. She nodded eagerly. But the moment Millie saw Violet, she stopped dead in her tracks. Her ears went flat, her tail tucked between her legs. Millie started barking, sharp, frantic barks, and backed away from Violet, dragging me by the leash. "What's wrong, Millie?" I asked, confused. Millie had never acted like this before. Violet didn't seem scared, just still, watching us. I tried to calm Millie down, but she wasn't having it. After a few more minutes of barking and dragging me away, I decided to head home. Violet flashed me a sad smile and waved as Millie dragged me away. That afternoon, I told my mom and grandma how weird it was that Millie didn't like my friend. She loved everyone. Mom asked what friend I was talking about, and I told her about my friend Violet, who lives a few houses away and who I've been playing with almost every day since we moved in with Grandma and Grandpa. Mom and Grandma exchanged an odd look. "Did you say Violet?" Grandma asked. "Yeah," I said, "my friend Violet." Mom was staring at Grandma, but Grandma just smiled at me and offered me a cookie before changing the subject. That night at dinner, though, Grandpa asked me about Violet. "Where does she live?" he asked, his voice casual, though his eyes were sharp, studying me. I told him she lives a few houses away, but I wasn't sure where. He nodded, but there was something in his gaze that I couldn't quite place. "Well, invite her over then," he said. "Let's meet her." I told him Violet wasn't allowed to come over. Mom and Grandma exchanged a glance, but Grandpa just nodded. As we ate our meatloaf, he asked me more questions about Violet. What did we do? Did we have fun? How did we play? I told him all about playing hide and seek and racing in the fields, exploring the woods, and taking our shoes off to walk through the brook where we tried, unsuccessfully, to catch frogs. He was quiet for a long moment before saying, "Sounds like fun. I'm glad you made a friend while you're here." Mom and Grandma looked at him, but Grandpa just smiled. "A little girl needs a friend," he said. And that was that. We played like we always did, until the day I had to leave. The last time I saw Violet was the day Mom and I packed up to leave the farm at the end of the summer. Mom had found us an apartment to rent back in our old town, so I wouldn't have to change schools. I was relieved to get back to my old friends, but sad to say goodbye to Violet. I found her by the big tree in the field, her face shadowed with sadness. "You're the best friend I've had in a long, long time," she said. I hugged her tight. "I'll miss you, Violet." She smiled and waved, then turned and disappeared into the woods. It was a strange goodbye, but I didn't think too much of it at the time. Years passed. Me and Mom visited my grandparents on holidays, but I never saw Violet again. I figured she'd grown up just like I did. Maybe she moved away or just found some new friends. I was in my last year of college when Grandma died, and the summer after I graduated, I decided to stay with Grandpa for a while. He needed help sorting through things, clothes to donate, old boxes to clean out, and I didn't mind. The house seemed emptier without Grandma, and I'm pretty sure he'd have eaten nothing but frozen dinners if I didn't fix him some home-cooked meals. One evening, a few days after I'd arrived, we were sitting at the dinner table when Grandpa mentioned that summer when Mom and I stayed with them. We laughed about fireworks on the 4th of July and him trying to teach me how to milk a cow. Then I mentioned Violet. Grandpa's face shifted. There was something strange about his expression. "You remember her, huh?" he said, his voice odd, distant. "Of course, why wouldn't I?" I replied, laughing. "We played every day. It was such a great summer. Does her family still live around here? It'd be fun to see her again." Grandpa grew quiet, his eyes narrowing. "No, her family isn't around anymore," he said. The words hung in the air like a stone sinking in water. I didn't press it. The conversation shifted, but something felt wrong. The next morning, Grandpa said he had an errand to run and left the house without another word. He came back about 2 hours later and insisted we take a drive. I was planning to spend the day in the basement sorting through old Christmas decorations, but Grandpa had other plans. We drove to the local library, where the librarian greeted him with a warm smile. "Welcome back, Charlie," she said. "Who's this?" "This lovely young lady is my granddaughter, Christina," Grandpa said, beaming. The librarian smiled at me, then led us to a back corner where a microfilm reader was set up. "It's all ready for you," she said to Grandpa. "What's all this about?" I asked, but Grandpa just gestured for me to sit at the reader. He clicked through the films, pulling up an old newspaper article. The headline read, "Fire Ravages Local Farmhouse." The fire had occurred not far from my grandparents. The article mentioned that the cause of the fire was still unknown, and that several family members were missing. The house was fully engulfed in flames by the time firefighters arrived. Grandpa clicked the reader, bringing up the next day's follow-up story. The fire had been caused by faulty wiring, and the family had been identified as the Abbotts. 3 bodies had been recovered from the charred wreckage, but were yet to be identified. The next article was the worst. The coroner had confirmed the identities of the victims. The parents, John and Lilith Abbott, and their 8-year-old daughter, Violet. And there, in black and white, was Violet's face. Big brown eyes and freckled nose. It was her school photo. It was the face I saw all summer long, the girl I'd played with, every day. I stared at the screen, unable to speak. The article was dated in June of 1983. I hadn't even been born until 1992 and spent the summer at my grandparents' house in the year 2000. How was this possible? I didn't want to think about it. I couldn't think about it. "I want to go home," I whispered to Grandpa. I couldn't process this. The drive back to the house was cold, despite the summer heat. Grandpa didn't say anything. He just let me sit with my thoughts. When we got home, he made us sandwiches. I was in a daze as he set the plate down in front of me. Then, quietly, he said, "You weren't the first to see her." "What?" I said, looking up at him, my voice shaking. He sat down across from me, looking at me with those sad, weathered eyes. "A couple of months after the fire, I was mowing the field. I saw her, Violet. We used to let her cut through the field on her way to school in the morning. And there she was, walking by like she always used to. She smiled at me and waved, just like nothing had happened. I thought I was losing my mind, until your grandmother saw her too." "Grandpa," I whispered, horrified. "You knew? You knew she was a ghost?" The last word hung there, heavy and ridiculous. He nodded. "I knew, but I didn't think it made sense to tell you, Christina. You were just a little girl, and she was a sweet kid. You both needed a friend that summer." I felt my chest tighten. "You should have told me. You should have. I trailed off, unsure of what I thought the right course of action would have been. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "If I had thought for 1 second she would have hurt you, I would have stopped it. But she was never dangerous. She was a sweet kid, just like you. And she'd been alone for so long. A little girl needs a friend. My head spun. It felt like a dream I knew I was having but couldn't wake up from. The conversation ended there, but it never left me. I continued helping Grandpa around the house, clearing out the basement and collecting Grandma's clothes. We never talked about Violet again, but I made peace with it all. He did what he thought was best, and how would I have reacted if he had told me the truth anyway? If he told me I'd been playing with a ghost? If he told me I had to stay inside all summer? No, he was right. It was better his way. That was nearly 10 years ago now. I finished grad school, got married, and had a daughter of my own. When my husband and I were discussing baby names, he said he liked Violet if it was a girl. I had never told him the story of that summer. I never told anyone. Grandpa passed away a couple of months ago, just a few weeks shy of 90. He left me the farm, the house in the fields. My mom didn't want any of it. We came out this summer to get the house in shape and decide what we wanted to do with the property. Keep it or sell it. Every morning I go sit outside looking over the same old fields, my baby Violet in my arms. Some mornings, if the light is just right, I catch a glimpse of my old friend walking by, and I smile. Bob. We thought we had found our dream home. I mean, it was beyond charming enough from the outside. Big, Victorian-style place, all creaky floors and high ceilings. It was one of those houses that looked like it had stories to tell, and it was the type of house I'd always dreamed of. My husband Tom, a carpenter, was ecstatic about all the little projects he'd have, and our little girl Emma, who had just turned 5, was over the moon about the big backyard after spending the first years of her life in a 2-bedroom apartment. I really thought it'd be the perfect place for our little family. And at first, everything was fine. The boxes were unpacked, and Emma was having a blast running around the yard with all of her new toys. But a few days after we moved in, Emma started talking about an imaginary friend. We thought it was cute at first. She was only 5, so it seemed harmless. She told us all about Bob and the silly things he'd do. "Who's Bob?" I asked. She grinned and pointed to the corner by the window. "That's Bob. He lives here. He likes to watch me draw." I chuckled and went about my day. I mean, Bob? What a silly name for a little girl to come up with for her imaginary friend. But not long after, things started getting strange. Emma started drawing pictures of Bob. Lots of pictures. And they were off. She'd always loved to draw, but now the images were twisted and dark. She would always draw Bob with dark, empty eyes, no mouth, and an extra long neck. He was always in one of the bedrooms upstairs, and there was this unsettling shadow in the corners of the room. I tried to brush it off. She was just being imaginative, right? But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She began talking about Bob more and more, like he was real, like he was always there, living with us. She'd sit in the corner and whisper to him when she thought we weren't listening. And sometimes I'd catch her staring into empty rooms like she was watching something no one else could see. Then she started passing messages on to us from Bob, and they weren't the friendliest. "Bob says you're not listening," she'd say, looking at me with those wide, innocent eyes. "Bob doesn't like the way you moved the chairs. He doesn't like our new furniture." The tipping point came when Tom started doing renovations on the house. One day, he and I were measuring inside one of the bedrooms, planning to repaint it and turn it into a home office. Emma came in, tugged on Tom's sleeve, and said, "Daddy, Bob says this is his bedroom, and you'd better not change it." I know it'll sound crazy to say this about my 5-year-old daughter, but there was something in the tone of her voice that sounded almost threatening. Tom and I decided to do some research, just to see if the house had any history. What we found out made my blood turn cold. The house was built in the early 1900s and stayed in the family for 2 generations, passing to the original owner's oldest son. He raised his own family there with his wife. They had 3 sons. The 2 older boys grew up, went to college, and moved out on their own. But their youngest son apparently had some developmental issues and never moved out. His name, of course, was Bob. After his father died, Bob stayed there with his mom. An elderly neighbor, Mrs. Howard, told us that Bob was a nice boy who became a nice young man, and while he wasn't able to hold down a job, he would mow the lawn, shovel the walk, and take care of his mom as best he could. When she passed away 20 years ago, he was distraught, and when his brothers decided to sell the house, it was more than he could take. Bob didn't want to leave. He couldn't leave. So after all their belongings were packed up and the house was sold, Bob went up to his bedroom one last time, the room Emma was always drawing her pictures of, and hanged himself. I felt sick as Mrs. Howard spoke. She told us that Bob had been close to the house, possessive of it. She said several families had lived there since, but none lasted long. They'd all complain about strange things, whispers, cold spots, feeling watched, but none stuck around long enough to figure out exactly what was going on. They simply cut their losses and ran. Mrs. Howard matter-of-factly said Bob didn't want anyone in the house, in his house, and she warned us, he'll do anything to keep it. That same night, I woke up with a chill, feeling watched. When I opened my eyes, I saw Emma, my sweet little girl, standing by the foot of our bed. She was holding a kitchen knife, just standing there, staring blankly at me and Tom. "Emma!" I shouted. It took her a second to snap out of it. Her eyes cleared, and she dropped the knife, her face flooded with confusion and fear. I jumped out of bed and wrapped my arms around her as Tom groggily woke up. I don't know what happened," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "The last thing I remember is Bob waking me up and telling me I needed to go to the kitchen." I somehow managed to keep calm for Emma's sake, but I knew we had to leave. Right then, right there. I made Tom grab a bag, and we left the house that very night. We stayed in a motel for several months until we finally sold the house. We took a huge loss, but we didn't care. As soon as we were gone, Emma went back to normal. No more imaginary friends, no more strange drawings. She's fine now, and any time I ask her about Bob, she just shakes her head and acts like she doesn't remember. I know it sounds crazy, but there's no doubt in my mind that Bob was real. I think he wants to keep anyone from taking his house, and he'd be willing to kill to do it. Don't follow. When I was 12, my family moved to a new town in a small house on the edge of the woods. I was excited. The town was quiet, the kind of place where kids could roam free, and the woods were just a stone's throw away. My brother, Luke, was 11, and we spent most of our days exploring. It felt like the start of an adventure. Little did I know the excitement would turn into something I'd never escape. One afternoon, not long after we moved in, our neighbor, Mrs. Cambridge, came over to welcome us. She was an old lady, her back hunched like she'd seen a lot in her time, but she seemed friendly enough. She brought cookies, which was a good way to win over a couple of kids. At one point, though, Mom and Dad went to the kitchen to get tea and snacks, and suddenly Mrs. Cambridge turned to me and Luke with a serious expression. "I've seen you two going into the woods," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "Now listen, it's very important you never go in there after dark, no matter what. And even before dark, never follow the boy into the woods. He'll lead you in too deep, and you'll get lost." Before we could even process what she'd said, Mom and Dad were back. The conversation quickly shifted to some boring adult talk. Mrs. Cambridge gave us a quick smile, but her eyes stayed sharp, like she was waiting for something. That night, I told Mom what she had said, hoping for some sort of reassurance. Mom seemed surprised, but shrugged it off, like it was just some advice about being careful in the woods. She's probably just telling you to be safe. And if someone you don't know shows up, she's absolutely right that you shouldn't follow them, she added. Still, I couldn't shake it. The boy. Who was she talking about? A few days later, we were back in the woods again, exploring, when we realized it was getting late. The sun was dripping behind the trees, and the shadows made everything feel creepier than they did in the daylight. I was sure I was hearing whispers, too, soft voices that seemed to be calling us, pulling us deeper into the forest. I thought about Mrs. Cambridge's words. Was it the boy calling to us? "Did you hear that?" I asked Luke, but he was already pushing forward, eager to see what was making the sounds. "I'm not scared," he said. but I could see his eyes flicking nervously around the darkening woods. "We need to go home," I said, trying to sound firm. I was the big sister, after all. But Luke wasn't convinced. "Come on, just a little further. It's so cool here. Don't you get it?" I heard the whispers again, clearer and louder this time, like someone was right behind us. And I insisted, "No, we have to go." Finally, he gave in, and we turned back. But the thought of the whispers kept gnawing at me. It wasn't just the wind. Over the coming days, Luke kept pushing to spend more and more time in the woods, begging me to stay later and later, drifting deeper and deeper in. It was all I could do to pull him out before the sun completely set and we were left in total darkness. "You used to be fun," he said one evening after I'd made him come back to the house with me. The next week, I had an orthodontist appointment, and Luke begged Mom to let him stay home and play video games instead of sitting in the boring waiting room. She eventually agreed, but made him promise to stay inside and keep the doors locked since Dad wasn't home yet. We were out for less than an hour, but when we returned, Luke was gone. Mom immediately panicked and called Dad at work. I was sure I knew where Luke was, but didn't want to say it. I didn't want to believe it. Finally, I told her everything, how he kept wanting to stay in the woods, how he was obsessed with them. Mom was still convinced he'd been kidnapped, but Dad and the police listened to me and figured Luke had just gone into the woods and gotten lost. A search party was formed, with Dad and much of the neighborhood joining. Mom stayed with me, frantic, and Mrs. Cambridge came over again to sit with us. She gave me a knowing look, a sad smile, and patted my arm. After a while, Mom took a phone call in the other room, and that's when I finally asked the question I'd been wondering about for weeks. "Who is the boy?" I asked. "What was that warning all about?" She sighed and looked at the floor. "Years ago, before you were even born, a group of boys went into those woods. One of them, Johnny, didn't come back. The others said he'd gotten lost, but they didn't even tell anyone about it when they got back. It wasn't until Johnny's parents started calling around asking questions that they said he'd wandered off while they were all playing. The police got involved. Then the sheriff's department came to help with their dogs. They searched for him for days." "Did they find him?" I asked, my throat tight. "Yes," she said softly, "but not in time. They found his body down by the creek. It was awful. He'd been, well, sweetheart, he'd been partially eaten. A bear, or maybe coyotes. His body was battered and torn apart. The coroner couldn't tell what damage happened before or after his death, but there were rumors about the boys he'd been with. They all had reputations as troublemakers, and some believed they had a hand in it, that they had hurt him. Maybe by accident, or maybe they lured him out there specifically to do something terrible. There was never any proof to it, and eventually those boys grew up and moved away. But ever since then, people have reported seeing or hearing Johnny in the woods. Whispers, calling to children to join him." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was heavy. 2 other kids have gone missing in those woods since then. They never came back. People think Johnny is still there, looking for playmates to join him, forever. Tears filled my eyes, but before I could say anything, Mom rushed in, also crying, but in relief. They found him, she said. "Luke's alive." I was so relieved I could barely breathe. But when Luke came home, he wasn't the same. He barely spoke, just one-word answers. When he did talk, all he would say is that he should have listened to Mrs. Cambridge. He never went near the woods again, and he'd lash out angrily if anyone asked him about that night. He was never the same after that. He struggled in school, then got into drugs. His depression deepened. Now, as an adult, he's been in and out of rehab, and I've had to help him out more times than I can count. Each time I think, maybe this will be different. He'll get sober, he'll take interest in things, but then he vanishes again. Not into the woods, but into a world of heroin and despair. A few weeks ago, I got a call from him in the middle of the night. I knew it was him before I even picked up. "I love you," he said, "and I'm sorry." He's made that same call dozens of times. I told him I loved him too, and that I just wanted him home, safe. There was a long pause. Then, Barely audible, he whispered, "I should have listened to Mrs. Cambridge. I never should have followed him." The line went dead. I don't know what happened to Luke that night in the woods. I don't know what he saw or what he heard. But in his mind, I think he's still out there, still lost in the woods. And after all these years, I'm worried he'll never find his way home. Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed these allegedly true scary stories about kids' paranormal experiences, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. We'll see you next time with more Whispers from the Pines.